This is the first part in a talk about something I call sustainable meaning. Human beings are not islands. We're connected to one another and our world in a biopsychosocial interaction that can be more or less sustainable. This interaction involves 4 ways our mind and brain relate to the world and 4 social dynamics that are produced as a result. The implication is that we are biologically interconnected into complex adaptive systems, social enterprises as small as families and as big as global economies, whose fates are tied to our own. These complex adaptive systems are modeled in our brain, where information about our fortunes in the system shapes how we feel biochemically. This conduit is bidirectional. It allows us to shape our world purposefully, and for our world to shape us biopsycho-spiritually. I argue that this bidirectional influence between our mind, brain, and environment is a kind of evolutionary meaning. I theorize that this evolved to drive cultural evolution. Sustainable meaning is fundamentally interdisciplinary, using ideas and insights from psychology, biology, anthropology, sociology, systems theory, and more. To organize the complex ways these ideas relate, we'll use a tool from integral philosophy that shows that each of these are reducible to 2 axes plotted against each other: the individual versus the collective, and the interior versus the exterior. This produces 4 quadrants: the individual interior, which is our subjective experience in psychology; the individual exterior, which is our brain and biology; the collective interior, or intersubjectivity, the study of culture and ideology; and the collective exterior, or interobjectivity, which is our society and systems. Each of these areas has known mechanisms that make them receptive to the influence of the other domains. The upper right quadrant of individual biology, for instance, is a brain that is plastic or changeable, rewiring itself and changing its biochemistry through experience. In the upper left quadrant, the subjective individual, we have the concept of representation, which is the function of the brain. Most other animals react to the world directly in front of them, but humans can be proactive and plan for environments we aren't yet in and haven't yet experienced. That's because our senses break the world into patterns, which we store as a model of how the world works in memory, and use to try to predict what will happen next. This allows imagination and goal-directed behavior, which essentially allows us to adapt to the world across space and time. It also gives the world a medium to change our brain. Everything from memories to stories to the anticipation of the future can affect our biopsychology. An implicit goal of sustainable meaning is to improve these representations. In the lower right quadrant, the collective exterior, we have society, which forms the physical systems we interact with. Societal life can be more or less sustainable in what it does to our mind and brain. The external collective is also home to transpersonal biological mechanisms like mirror neurons, which are neurons that fire when you perform a particular action or emotion, and when you observe the same action or emotion being performed by someone else. This allows us to subjectively understand the intentions and emotions of others, and for our subjective experiences to affect one another. Finally, in the lower left quadrant, the subjective we have culture, which is a shared representation of the world, sometimes called a paradigm, worldview, or ideology. Cultural representations are heritable through language, as language can activate and change the representations in our plastic brain. Cultural representations provide a common subjective framework between people, a framework for shared meaning. Cultural representations are transmitted across generations, allowing them to evolve, the facilitation of which is also a goal of sustainable meaning. Now that we have some broad understanding of how these areas connect, let's see how we go from a brain that processes information like a computer would to a brain that is highly subjective, irrational, and of dubious mental stability. In the individual objective portion of our quadrant, we will put 4 biochemical circuits: dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and testosterone. These chemicals have been experimentally associated with different kinds of subjective qualia or feelings and respond to particular kinds of social and environmental information. Dopamine with information about goals, novelty, and rewards; oxytocin with information that is win-win, affiliative, or cooperative; testosterone with information that is win-lose, competitive, or status-based; and serotonin with information that is lose-lose, unfair, or aggressive. In the individual subjective portion of our quadrant, we see different feedback loops between our action on some object in the environment and the biochemical effect that produces a change in our subjective experience. These changes are also associated with psychological resources or liabilities. For instance, the anticipation of goal-directed rewards can create motivation, creativity, and curiosity, or anxiety, anhedonia, and apathy when absent. A sense of connection creates trust, safety, and generosity, or paranoia, fear, and stress when disconnected. The experience of friction creates hostility, impulsivity, and obsession, or calmness and fairness without it. Finally, perceived competition creates either domination or submission, decisiveness or stress, confidence or insecurity, depending on whether you're winning or losing. In the objective we can see how these interactive feedback loops add up across interactions and individuals to become something bigger, called biostructures, which are different social structures built from each type of interaction. Our interaction with these biostructures has a huge impact on our subjective experience. For instance, many goal-directed brains creates cultural goals and agendas that we can fight for or against. Many interconnected win-win relationships creates a web-like social network that we can be inside or outside. Lose-lose friction also spreads on social networks, often down power gradients towards those in the bottom, and breaks networks down. Alternatively, friction can be avoided by the buildup of fair social rules enforced by tit-for-tat punishment systems. Finally, win-lose competition in games for status self-organize into social hierarchies that can be based on leadership and cooperative goals, or dominance and power for its own sake. In the subjective we, cultural ideologies use language to not just model these dynamics mentally, but to interpret them subjectively. Corresponding to our cultural goals are cultural dreams, imagined goal states that motivate us toward utopian visions like the American dream. Social networks are modeled through mental sociograms shaped by a subjective sense of in-group identity and out-group xenophobia. Social friction uses judgment of others to track who plays by the rules and who breaks them, creating a mental category for bad guys, which is just as likely to be scapegoats, usually those at the bottom. Finally, the social hierarchy is an internalized map of relative status between people, with respect for those at the top and disrespect for those at the bottom, complete with a justification for how and why the game is played as is. There is a cosmological reason that these dimensions are all connected, something in systems theory called self-organization. Our subjective sense of meaning, both internal and external, individual and collective, likely evolved to self-organize into something bigger. In this case, a complex adaptive system that itself evolves through cultural evolution. In fact, one of the ways complex adaptive systems evolve is to use meaning as feedback to create new forms of social organization, new kinds of rules, new kinds of goals, new kinds of communities, and new ways of sharing power. Through this relationship between the individual and the collective, human nature can upgrade itself, and human civilization can progress. Putting together a model of meaning with our understanding of human nature, you have a human being who represents the world not as a detached computer, but as a meaningful story. What's more, because this story is told through physical substrates of neurons and neurotransmitters, the story can affect our physical well-being. Shaping the constraints of that story are patterned social systems that can make us spiral up or spiral down. Or cultural and ideological software that interprets our experience to make us feel alone or connected, high status or low, righteous or judged, hopeful or depressed. All of these are the ingredients that span scientific disciplines, but are nevertheless joined at the hip in the recipe of sustainability. If we're to control our interaction with the world for the better, it means not only helping ourselves, but helping our social and cultural worlds as well. As we will see, this need to channel our inner feedback toward external change is the equation for a sense of purpose, and it is why we've evolved biological meaning, to drive us to push our world toward more sustainable horizons and to become a part of something bigger than ourselves.